As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Not only does it depend on individual differences, and as Emily and we've all been saying, it's these vulnerable kids that use social media, it is going to amplify their vulnerabilities.
We actually need to be regulating big tech for everyone, partly because age verification is such an epic fail. But I would like to be less aggressively tracked by algorithms as well.
There's a lot of research that shows that if we can lean into stress versus say all stress is bad, that makes a difference. So fear as an approach to this with parents doesn't work.
The point is, can you be thoughtful in a critical way about your behavior? Do you have self-awareness? Do you know the feeling of this is too much time and it's not feeling good anymore? That was our first Experts Roundtable on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are 4 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
I am so excited to welcome our listeners to this very special episode. We are doing something we've never done here at Psychologists Off the Clock, and that is having a roundtable discussion with several experts, and it's going to be all about smartphones and social media and kids' mental health. We're doing this because it's such a hot topic these days, and it's getting a lot of press. We all care about the well-being of our kids and teenagers, and we've long been curious about what is the impact of all this technology. And there are some very extreme opinions going around and getting a lot of press. So we have been concerned about the role of fear-mongering in today's conversation about youth and phones, and we want to offer a more positive and productive message. So I connected with a few experts in this area for a discussion today with the goal of having a more balanced and nuanced conversation based on both research and the real lives of families grappling with this issue. So as we prepare for this discussion today, the panelists and I agreed that our goal for the listeners is to have a more empowering and reality-based narrative about youth and technology that can also equip parents and other adults to approach youth with the goal of building productive digital citizens in our digital world, rather than banning or heavily restricting phones and social media from their lives. My co-host, Debbie Sorensen, has graciously agreed to facilitate the discussion, and she'll start us off by introducing our panelists.
Okay, we are delighted to have 4 experts in this area today, all of whom I describe as friends of the show because each has been on the podcast before. So really thrilled that everyone's here. And so I am going to just introduce everyone. Tracy Dennis Tawari, PhD, is a professor of psychology and neuroscience and the director of the Emotion Regulation Lab at Hunter College. She's the author of the book Future Tense: Why Anxiety is Good for You Even Though It Feels Bad. She co-founded the digital health company Arcade Therapeutics, where she translates neuroscience and cognitive therapy research from her lab into clinically validated game-based treatments for mental health. She's been featured throughout the media, from the New York Times and Wall Street Journal to the Today Show and Bloomberg Television. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Ellen Galinsky is president of the Families and Work Institute and serves as senior science advisor to AASA, the school superintendent organization, and has served as a senior advisor to the media office of the Assistant Secretary of Youth Mental Health at the Administration for Children and Families, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Her most recent book, The Breakthrough Years, a new scientific framework for raising thriving teens, came out this year. Welcome, Ellen.
It's wonderful to be here, and I'm so grateful to you all for having this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. Devorah Heitner, PhD, is the author of Growing Up in Public, Coming of Age in a Digital World, and Screenwise, Helping Kids Thrive and Survive in Their Digital World. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Atlantic. She has a PhD in Media, Technology, and Society from Northwestern University and has taught at DePaul and Northwestern. She is delighted to be raising her own teenager. Welcome, Devorah. It's great to have you back.
Thank you.
And you all know Dr. Emily Edlin, a psychologist and the author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting, Reduce Parental Burnout and Raise Competent, Confident Children, and the Emotions Journal for Kids, In Your Feels. And of course, you all know her as a co-host of Psychologists Off the Clock. Welcome, Emily.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for pulling this together. Can you orient us to what's going on and why this is such a hot topic right now and why you decided to have this panel?
Yes. So in our offline talks among the experts sitting here today, we were all kind of having the same conversation about noticing how much alarmist messaging is going on and really starting to dominate, especially parent and school communities. And that narrative is the idea that smartphones have caused a generation of anxious teenagers. So I'm hearing a lot, everyone's hearing a lot, how the recent book, Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, quote unquote, proves what we've all been worried about, which is phones must be ruining our kids. Some listeners may know that I debated Haidt about this topic for the Institute of Art and Ideas over the summer, and we can put the link in the show notes for that. So I'm really passionate about this topic because what has deeply concerned me about the anxious generation message is that, one, the data actually does not, quote unquote, prove this at all. Two, the idea adds so much stress and anxiety to parents who are already completely overwhelmed. And three, even the label anxious generation pathologizes our children, and the approach of blanket banning and restrictions of phones and social media undermines their agency and autonomy, which of course I'm a huge advocate for. So I've just really noticed in my own communities how this anxious generation message has caused more anxiety in parents. And that's what really motivated me to do what we can with our Psychologists Off the Clock platform to deliver a message that can be more useful, less alarmist, and more empowering. So that was what got me inspired to pull this together. And I'm very grateful to the very busy people we have who were able to make time to join us today.
So I think we should talk more about the extreme position that's going around and that a lot of people are taking when it comes to this question of phones and kids. I think most of us agree that it's worth considering this question, right? What is the impact of technology on well-being for all of us, kids, teenagers, and adults, right? It's a good question, but we have noticed this really extreme alarmist position. I'm going to ask this question for Tracy. Tracy, what do you think are some of the consequences of taking such an extreme stance here, this narrative? Are there downsides to this?
Yeah, and that is a really important first question to start with, because I think we can all agree that probably less screen time would be better for everyone. So I don't think any of us here in this conversation are saying, yeah, just, let your kids on 24/7 onto those phones, and you should be doing it too. So I think that we really have to think through, why does this absolutist stance that phones have caused the youth mental illness crisis, why do we need to push back against that? The very first reason is that these absolutist stances create and force a false binary in the discussion. And that binary is either this view that phones are bad for kids, or screens and social media are bad for kids. Either that's a moral panic, right? Or it must be true. And these are the single most important causes of youth mental illness striking our kids today. And I think neither of those extremes can be supported. And so, but when you take this stance, you're forcing us to these most extreme instead of being in what sometimes feels like the messy middle. And, we see this in public health happening all the time. You take an extreme stance, you polarize the conversation. And the solutions that are suggested by these extremes, they almost never work. So, for example, we can see this just in the past 40, 50, 60 years. The Just Say No campaign, the anti-drug campaign that we saw Nancy Reagan and others take up in the 80s. This led to, you guys remember the DARE program, the drug abuse resistance education program that I think at a certain time in the 80s was in 75% of schools. And this was essentially telling kids and all of us to just say no to drugs. Now, first of all, this program, it turned out that in 2001, the US Surgeon General said that this program was a failure. So it did not keep kids off drugs. But second of all, what it did is it diverted resources away from actual programs that could help kids in communities, including prevention programs that are focused on at-risk kids, including, maybe better resources for drug addiction treatment. And then, of course, you saw the massive incarceration and over-incarceration of people for drug abuse crimes that were minor infractions that disproportionately affected communities of color and under-resourced communities. So instead of saying kids are taking drugs, we need to do something, instead of coming up with a workable, thoughtful, nuanced approach, this Just Say No approach really backfired and might have even made things worse. And I think that we're at risk for that when it comes to this stance towards digital literacy, because it's an opportunity cost. We won't learn how to navigate the realities of digital in our lives if we push people to these extremes. And I'd love people to jump in on that in addition, but that's one of the key problems I see.
My understanding, too, of what became a successful, in the anti-smoking campaign, was when there was more focus for adolescents. You're being manipulated by these companies, and their sense of agency and autonomy being threatened was more motivating than fear-based messages.
Right. The Just Say No to smoking actually increased smoking. And when they switched to build on the need that adolescents have for autonomy, those efforts actually worked.
Yeah, and I see that in the digital realm when we talk with young people about the design features that might keep you playing a game longer than you intended to play the game when you had other things you also wanted to do. They're really interested in how those design features work, and they're really curious about how they can have their own autonomy, even though they're working with something that is designed to keep you there. And so, yes, absolutely tapping into, especially with adolescents, the drive for autonomy and wanting to also feel like you're smarter than the machine in the case of tech is really helpful, much more helpful than a sort of abstinence-only conversation. I always cite that drug commercial in my talks to parents at schools. The mom, I learned it from you, right? The fried egg, and Mom, I learned it from you, Mom. And I'm thinking people are saying to their kids, don't text and drive, and then they're doing it in front of their kid.
On the abstinence, I just want to add in, too, another public health exemplar of this was the AIDS crisis, when the abstinence campaigns directly backfired and led to more unsafe sex. And it was only when the safe sex campaign really took hold that you started to see benefits in terms of public health and safety. So again, if you're saying, well, don't use phones, you're not, this addiction, this abstinence metaphor it's just not the right one. I think the right one is going to be, and I'm sure we'll get to this, something more like a driver's license, something more like that requires education and literacy. But I just want to add that abstinence piece again. It is not a successful strategy if we want to actually help people.
And we will save time toward the end to talk about some strategies and things that we could do that will be helpful with that. How do we navigate this? I think we all have some thoughts on that. I do want to turn the conversation to Ellen, because much of your work centers on how we view adolescents and how sometimes there are a lot of stereotypes about them, which can in and of themselves be harmful. How do you think this more absolutist, extreme, fear-based stance toward phones and social media feeds into problematic stereotypes for teens?
Well, I actually want to jump back to parents for a second before I get to teens, which is that if you look at the beginning of John Haidt's book, it talks about strapping your kids into a spaceship and going off to Mars without us paying any sense of that. And that is terrifying. That is totally building on what is a very important need we all have to protect our children. So it works. I mean, everybody says, oh my gosh, I don't want that to happen. But it is not helpful for parents, because when we're just responding in a fear-based way, we are not as open to learning as we might be. There's a lot of research that shows that if we can lean into stress versus say all stress is bad, that makes a difference. So fear as an approach to this with parents doesn't work. And then for adolescents, before these books or this discussion was as hot as it is now, I ask adolescents, what should adults know about people their age? Open-ended question, nationally representative sample, and 38% of them, which is a huge number for a open-ended survey, said, stop making assumptions about all of us, and negative assumptions at that. Now they would say, don't call us all anxious, but then they said, don't call us all lazy, don't call us all snowflakes, don't call us all entitled. They did talk about don't call us all addicted to our phones. They wrote, the internet is not going to be the end of us. It doesn't define us, and it's not the end of us. And so that's something that I really object to, which is defining all teenagers as anxious. There is a mental health crisis, just like none of us would say that total use of phones or social media is good. We all think that there absolutely have to be limits. Also, it's really important not to just make assumptions about all teenagers as anxious, all teenagers as addicted. They're really bristling against that, and that works against any solutions.
How do you think that this more alarmist stance affects parents and any dangers as relates to them? Devorah, yeah.
I think it can really divide parents in a community, because this is something where parents have been screen shamed. And then unlike other aspects of parenting, especially in early childhood, where parents may be in more community on the playground or at birthday parties, in those years, even then, it can be hard to sort of talk about Roblox or Minecraft if you don't know. Some other parent may sort of throw you under the bus of mommy judgment if you even bring up Minecraft, because maybe their kid only plays with wooden blocks. Or that's what they believe. They don't know that their kid is playing Grand Theft Auto at a friend's house or something. And so, or playing with mom's phone, when she's napping or whatever. So there's this belief that, it's really tough for parents to then find community. And what I encourage parents to do is be in the conversation with other parents. And especially if you're lucky enough to also know parents of older kids, whether it's, your own siblings, maybe, and your kids' cousins are older, or people in the community, asking them about what do you wish you knew before you greenlit a phone or Snapchat or a particular gaming device, because it's really helpful to talk to other families about their experiences. And, maybe another parent says, oh, I wish I knew I could get my kid a phone, but not greenlight TikTok right away, and help them learn to text first, or really pragmatic things. But because parents are being encouraged to judge each other, sign pledges now in communities that they're all going to be uniformly waiting till a certain age instead of trusting families to have decisions about their own kids and their own kids' readiness. And also, every family is different. Families kids in two households might have a different need for a communication device at an earlier age than a kid who lives in one household with two parents and also has a nanny and is never home alone, right? So I think it's just really can divide parents when we start judging and encouraging judgment, actually.
What this has done is this has added to the problem of intensive parenting pressures that has been a big part of the dialogue, really being reignited again with the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, calling on the stress and burden put on parents as a public health crisis just recently in the past month or so. And what you see in this notion of intensive parenting, it's sort of helicopter and snowplow parenting on overdrive. It's sort of the logical consequence of 4 decades of parents being expected to do emotionally absorbing, time-intensive, financially expensive, extremely involved parenting, micromanaging of their children in this age where we feel like their futures are not secure anymore. And, there's that stat that's astounding that working moms today spend more time with their children than stay-at-home moms in the 70s. And that's not to say that we don't love spending time with our kids, and I'm the mom of teenagers too, but that means we're doing that at the cost of other things that we can do to promote our own health and to do other things in life, and probably perhaps hovering too much over kids. So we have this culture of intensive parenting that all of us feel the pressure around. And now comes this judgmental notion that, and you can't have your kids on screens because it's going to destroy them. And so just this additional pressure and this kind of shackling parents to the expertise, so to speak, of these people making these loud, extreme calls for banning phones and undermining their own parents' own autonomy and ability to make reasonable choices in their life. I just think that's another very important context here.
Okay, and Ellen, let's turn it to you.
Well, I just want to weigh in and say how much I hate the concept of intensive parenting. I think it's another blame game. I've watched a lot of blame games. I wrote my first books about parenting in the 1970s, and I have watched a lot of blame gaming going on over the years. The words change. What we're doing, there's so many reasons why I hate it. In fact, I'm writing an op-ed about it right now. But one of the things we're doing is conflating time that we spend with our children with fixing things for them. We need to pay attention to what we're doing during that time. Involvement with kids is never bad. It's you can have as much involvement as long as it's autonomy supportive. So I think that as long as we're helping children learn to fix their own problems and not fixing them for them. So intensive parenting is just one more thing. I'm just watching the debates about it in the newspaper all of the time. It's just one more thing for us to feel guilty and we've done something wrong by paying attention to our children.
I don't want to go off on a tangent on that. I do disagree with that because I actually experience that as both a parent and a professional in this field is actually a freeing notion that is actually marking and kind of signifying the external pressures that have been mounting on parents over the past 3 or 4 decades, and that the Surgeon General also points out. So I see it in a different light, although I also see what you mean by conflating fixing problems for kids, which is not a helpful developmental move for parents to make, versus just time spent. So I do disagree with you a bit on that.
Helen.
Yeah. If I could just jump back in, having watched this and done studies of the U.S. workforce since the 1980s, parents have felt pressure. Those levels of pressure have been there. I totally agree with you that there are external forces pressuring us, but just the word intensive parenting puts the blame on us as if we're doing something wrong, we're being too intense, versus there are being pressured as a parent, I think would be a more accurate way to talk about it. We do have a lot of pressures and those pressures change. We've neglected, if you look at the Surgeon General's report, neglected the pressures of work on us that focus on the time we spend at work, but not the work environment. And that I've seen in my research over 30 years really does affect us. So we do absolutely need to pay attention to the pressures on us, but not describe us as intensive parents.
So speaking of pressures and the Surgeon General advisory, I think that, Emily, one thing you've really taught me to look at here is that Okay, first of all, it's this mental health debate. There's a lot of complexity to it. Obviously, there are many, many factors here, which is part of the reason we don't want to just focus on one factor, right? Is that this is a complex issue. And Emily, one of the things that you've really pointed out is that the stress parents experience is also a factor, right? And that factor is often very much overlooked in this debate. So can you give us some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think it's a perfect kind of segue from that discussion about intensive versus pressured parenting, because the bottom line is parents are completely overwhelmed and overly stressed. And there's no way to say that does not affect our children and our relationships with our children. And that is why I'm really passionate about having this counter messaging around technology, is because we can't bear this burden of more fear. And the problem that I see both in my therapy office and just in my community is how parents are taking this message of, oh my gosh, phones and social media are going to ruin my child, so I need to completely restrict, ban, stop it. And then what happens is major conflict. And when that conflict is starting to, and this actually happened personally, and I've talked about this a lot in my book and in interviews, when your relationship with your child is completely breaking down because you're arguing over technology, what is the cost of that? And which one, do you preserve? Do you preserve your screen time limits, or do you preserve your relationship by really understanding where they're coming from, being more collaborative with them? And I saw how that changed my relationship with my child. And what I worry about is the fear messaging by nature makes us more reactive instead of proactive. And then when we're more reactive, we're more controlling. And being controlling means we're not supporting our children's autonomy. So it's this domino effect that I think we need to be talking about, because our relationships undoubtedly affect our child's mental health more than screen time. If you just look at the decades of research on child mental health, the parent-child relationship is a significant factor.
Tracy.
And just to add, that's such a beautiful point. The way that we parent is so determined by the mindset that we come in with. And when we're scared and when phones are evil and contaminating, we cannot be at our most autonomy supporting. We cannot be our most flexible. We can't see that. And we've known this for a long time as people have talked about digital literacy and digital citizenship. This needs to be a collaborative process with our kids so that we understand what is the value you get from digital, from social media, from these technologies, and what does it cost you? Because kids often know that cost. And so I just want to really, really underscore that crucial point that you made, Emily.
As a parent myself, I think I feel exactly what's being described here, that this is another thing that's on me to solve. I feel like this is crucial for our kids' well-being, but I'll probably never get it right. For example, when I read some of the more extreme positions or hear some of the more extreme positions, I feel this pang of guilt, like, sometimes I let my kids be on their iPad so I can get some work done. Am I ruining the. And I think kind of going back to this idea that overly focusing on this as the main driver of children's mental health, that maybe there are some unintended consequences, right? Like other factors that, for instance, might be overlooked. So parental stress is one of them.
We can also, of course, take people's minds off looking at the bigger picture of community-based solutions and looking at where can kids hang out in person. If we say that that's so important, how are we making that possible? What are schools doing? And when we see the incredible decrease in recess, over 40 years or more, and silent lunches at some schools, obviously that has tremendously impacted kids and gives them too little space to learn the really crucial in-person hangout and social skills. I think we also miss a lot when we ignore the positive impact. Like a lot of times parents will say to me, oh, my kid is so isolated. He only plays games with his friends online. And that might be a kid who would have no social with peers, right? If they weren't playing an online game with those peers. Like it's not like, oh, necessarily that kid would be at the skate park, every day hanging out with peers. And does that even exist in that community? So I think we also have to look at what is that game bringing to that child in terms of social connection and fun experiences. And yes, is there a way that family can help that child bridge to also maybe hang out in person and game in person with those friends, and maybe then bridge to doing some other activities as well? Because we do want kids to have practice with face-to-face social interaction. But to not see that this might actually be, instead of the child being totally isolated, is a real miss in terms of just curiosity of like, also, what are they learning in the games? I think we're going to see a whole generation of engineers that grew up playing Minecraft. And if we're missing that, if we're not curious about that, then we're really neglecting something very important that's happening with kids.
Helen.
Well, I'll jump in here, having a grandson who loved Minecraft, but who learned to program with Java, and then went and took a course in computer arts. So I think it's really important to expand their interests. But going back to what you said, Debbie, I think it's so important that we as parents not feel we have to solve this alone, because we can't. That's the freak out notion. It's up to technology companies to fix the algorithms that so engulf kids. Their schools have a role in this, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later. But we can't fix this alone. If it's us versus technology, us single parents sitting in our house versus technology, it's just not going to work. We need, in a positive way, not just the parent against parent, but in a positive way, are all working together. And some of the suits against the media companies and holding them responsible, I think are a good idea, because I'm not sure that they're going to take responsibility without some sort of societal pressure on them.
And Tracy.
And I think that societal pressure that Ellen was mentioning that's needed for these companies to start being forced to do the right thing. Well, these extremist stances, they're doing it maybe because they want to get the policymakers and the politicians to like crack down on these companies. And so you start to be like, well, maybe that's the way. But the truth is, as they're spending all this time, all these resources and attention on regulating these companies, they're ignoring actually devoting resources to the bigger predictors of youth mental illness. And that includes adult struggles with mental illness. And
Exactly.
I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about that. But you see everyone, p-value hack their way, or like cherry pick the correlations out of these studies and say, oh, well, time on screens correlates at 0.2 with child mental health outcomes. And then you see correlations between the caregivers of these kids who are committing suicide at higher rates. They're addicted. They're struggling with mental illness. And the correlations between that and youth mental illness are much more on the order of 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, these huge correlations, obviously. So it's this huge opportunity cost that we're not mentioning nearly enough.
Emily, I want to hear from you on this point.
Well, I completely agree and echo that, and just add that some of the fear-based messaging is talking about, the sexual predators online and kind of drumming up our very worst fears. But the reality is, my understanding is it's really the same kids that are vulnerable, both online and in real life. And that's who we need to be supporting, are these kids with vulnerabilities to that unsafe and risky, what can happen online, but not necessarily. And so I think there's, again, a skewing of reality that is panicking everyone, but we really need to be bolstering the protective effects for those most vulnerable kids. And we won't do that if we're just focused on an entire generation at once.
Devora, let's hear from you again.
Tracy, you said earlier it's not a moral panic, but I do think kids are being used very astutely to make these arguments for regulation. And one of the things I've argued, and I wrote about this for Newsweek recently, is that we actually need to be regulating big tech for everyone, partly because age verification is such an epic fail. But I would like to be less aggressively tracked by algorithms as well. And I would like to not see certain things in my feed as well. And so my big argument has been we need to make social media in particular and algorithm-based things like YouTube better for everyone, not just kids. That's a better way to protect kids. And it also takes the argument away about like what age and all of these kinds of questions, which I do think are mostly better left to families and educators. I'm not saying that I wouldn't like to see some more, better age verification, maybe for things like pornography. But the fact is, it is a fail. Like we're not seeing it work, and there's huge data risks and privacy risks. So we also have to just look at kids are being used as a political pawn. Basically, we were like, save the children, so we have to fix YouTube for the children. I would like it fixed for all of us.
I'll jump in with just something that I think is an undercurrent here that I want to make explicit before we move on, which is just I feel like there's a little bit of a social justice issue going on here too that I think is like a red herring to me, so that we are ignoring other social and cultural problems going on that are really feeding into this. And it's almost like a look away. We're just going to focus on this one thing and we're going to really regulate that and be all, up in arms about it. It's like, yes, but we can't forget so many of the other risk factors and social factors that kids face. And I think that's kind of just an expansion on a point that's being made here. So that's important too, right? We have to look at the big picture because of all the things that are contributing.
And we have to use science responsibly. I mean, the thing that makes me the craziest as a researcher is that when science is misused, it leads people to just saying mental health problems are caused by only one factor, and that's your phone. That's just making people worry about what science really says. And it goes against what we know from science. That's why this discussion is so wonderful. But we need to make sure that people understand that that's not what science says, but science is important in helping us all make decisions.
Ellen, I couldn't have asked for a better segue here, because we are going to move into what does the science actually say about this, right? Because it's being conveyed in a particular way in the popular press right now. And I'm actually going to start us off on this conversation, Tracy, if you're willing.
Sure.
Let's take a look on it. What does the research say about this possible causal link between phones and social media and youth mental health?
And I'll preface too by saying that I am both a reader of this research, but I've been conducting this research for the past 10, 12 years. So it's complicated.
Well, that's all you need to know, folks.
2 words, we're done.
But it harms on whom, for whom, and how, and when people are using these technologies, which obviously is the truth. So, and the big problem is that this field has allowed such a low standard of research, of methodological rigor during the peer review process, because we're also desperate to understand how technology might be impacting us, that a lot of this is garbage in, garbage out. But there are some good studies out there. And my read of the best evidence, not only does it depend on individual differences, as Emily and we've all been saying, it's these vulnerable kids that use social media, it is going to amplify their vulnerabilities. So we know that that's part of what's happening. But when research just looks at amount of screen time, it's 2 hours a day, it's 5 hours a day, it's 9 hours a day, that tells us nothing about the mechanisms through which risk is conveyed, or resilience for that matter. Because remember, if 20 to 30% of kids, if they're struggling emotionally or otherwise, that means that the 60 or 70% of kids in relation to social media are doing okay. So we need to understand mechanisms of risk and resilience. Now, when I say mechanisms, what do I mean? It means the ways in which being on screens can cause harm or give benefit. And the best research out there suggests that the usual suspects like social comparison, bullying, these kinds of things can, of course, be kind of the means through which screens can have a negative impact. But that's the same in the real world, right? There's something that is somewhat interesting that might be unique to how these technologies have been developed, which is that they are these little behavioral modification machines, of course, that their only goal was to suck us in and get eyeballs on and create compulsive use. That's the business model. Now, what that means is that we have these little escape machines, these little emotional escape machines in our hands, anytime we're bored or distressed or upset. So we know from an emotion regulation standpoint that some people can get lost in these devices, start to avoid emotional distress in ways that actually are related to problems of depression and anxiety and suicidality. That the emotional avoidance, that absorption that they can stimulate can also be part of the problem. There's, of course, sleep deprivation, inactivity. We know that if you're actively using these technologies in creative ways rather than passively consuming, it's sort of like you're eating your vegetables instead of eating a bag of chips. That we know that those different kinds of ways tend to predict. So if you're passively consuming, it tends to be related to worse outcomes and emotional distress. Whereas if you're creatively using these technologies, it can actually be associated with some real benefits. So in a nutshell, it's complicated. It depends. But we know that these technologies are amplifiers, and we know that there are particular things that happen that we can target with more precision than just screen time, that we can target to help protect kids and actually also amplify any benefits that might be there.
Wow, that's a really good summary of the complexity and of the kind of the overall findings. Does anyone want to add anything to this piece? Devora, yes, this is your area too, of course.
There's really great research also about different modes of parenting around tech that shows that parents who act as mentors for their kids and who understand the apps and spaces their kids are using, who are in conversation with kids about things like media and body image, for example, A, has a really protective effect, and B, those kids are using media with lower risk and greater joy. And there's also some research that suggests that kids who are very, very restricted from media are missing out on some important social connection. And for those of us who currently have teenagers, that would just say, we're also probably living that at home. If you tell a kid you can't text or be on any social media, how would they interact with their peers that's where invitations are made, that's where connections are made, that's where things are going on. And so there is some research that suggests that limiting is a limited strategy for parents, and just restriction alone, whereas mentoring can be really helpful. And I will also say too that kids are hearing about this research. Kids are hearing headlines like the one 4 years ago have smartphones destroyed a generation. And I think that affects their self-esteem and kind of some of the things Ellen was talking about of don't limit us. And it also makes them feel a little bit bad about themselves when they go on their phones in a way that I think is unhelpful.
We just got a little snap from Tracy.
We're all saying, I'm in.
Well, let me ask Tracy a follow-up question. So when you read certain sources that shall will not be named, which imply that the research is totally clear, supporting, that this is the sole cause and all research support this. I mean, how is that happening? Are they just straight up misrepresenting the data? Are they cherry picking? What's happening here?
It's very, very easy to take a single graph or a single stat out of the context of not only a larger study, but a particular statistical methodology that ensures that you don't have false positives, to incorrectly say that there's a significant finding when there's not, et cetera. There are all these customs and conventions that we scientists follow that I will say are systematically violated by that kind of an approach. So, for example, there's been some discussion about, some recent meta-analyses of large data sets. One set, which was looking at correlations between youth mental health symptoms and well-being, subjective well-being, and amount of screen time. Another one on, what if you have people get off the social media for a period of time? Does that help or harm people? And so what will happen is you'll look at that large meta-analysis and you'll say, well, they did this meta-analysis that showed no significant effect. But what if I take just the girls from the sample? And what if I take just those studies that have this XYZ characteristic? Well, then the correlation goes from 0.09 to 0.19 or 0.2. And that small correlation is significant, and it also makes a difference. But the truth is, when you cherry pick these data out of the larger study, you're no longer working within the world of statistics. You're no longer working within the conventions of what all scientists agree are the ways that you have to actually interpret these data. So it becomes, in some sense, no better than an anecdote. So for example, we know that some data around suicide increases in youth, which is everyone's nightmare. I've just actually finished an NIH grant studying teen risk for suicide. For privacy, I won't be mentioning anything about that study, but I can tell you it's heartbreaking. And so none of us who care about kids believe that there's not a problem here. And when you actually look at data that suggest, screening procedures and screening procedures in emergency rooms have actually driven most of the stats on increases in suicide that started happening around 2010, 2012, which is the evidence that's used to suggest it's because of the phones. Well, you have to put this other context into the conversation, and that context is ignored. And the last thing I'll say in 60 seconds, I'm sorry, once I get into the data and I was pulling my hair, I pull my hair out when I look at these distortions. The only other thing I'll say is that when you have these badly designed studies with clear methodological flaws and you try and overinterpret them, you can't do it. So then you go to the studies that were designed to ask these questions. There's a very well-known study called the ABCD study. It's a prospective longitudinal study, 12 research sites across the country, the largest of its kind, funded by the NIH. And it was designed to ask questions like, does amount of screen time use in childhood predict teen mental health? And with the best data and huge sample sizes, not only have they found really nothing significant, when they do find slight suggestions, the researchers continually, they'll find some small correlation or some brain difference. It doesn't reach significance. The researchers say, there might be a trend here, but it's clearly much more than just technology. So even the excellent studies that are designed to detect these predictive causal links between technology and youth mental health, they are failing to support that hypothesis. And that is systematically ignored by people arguing that phones have destroyed our kids. Let me take a breath.
Ellen. Thank you, Tracy.
That's an incredibly wonderful and clear analysis of the research. And I just can't tell you how strongly I feel that we need to actually look at the science. Just two other points I want to make, which is that the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering convened a group of experts who spent months looking at, does social media cause a mental health crisis? And they concluded that you can't say that it is more complex. It's more nuanced. For some children, it does matter, but it's only for some children under some circumstances. So I'm just echoing what Tracy said. The second thing is just an analogy that Eva Telsler, who's done wonderful research on this at the University of North Carolina, says. She said you wouldn't look at issues of obesity by just looking at how much time children eat. And our whole notion, screen time, wonderful.
That's great. You was great.
Yeah. And our whole notion of screen time, which is where so much of at least the early research focused, is just, a crazy notion. She talks about living in the digital world, and that just underlies that there are many more things happening in the digital world than simply the amount of time that kids spend on screens.
Well, there's some information that is maybe not a peer-reviewed research study here, but that I think is also very important to acknowledge, which is what the teenagers are saying themselves about this. And we've kind of alluded to this a couple of times, but I know that Devora and Ellen, you both talk to teenagers, you both, incorporate their point of view in your work. Could you tell us a little bit? I'm not sure which one of you wants to start, but what are the teenagers saying about this? Do they think this is a problem, and do they advocate a complete ban or a zero limits policy on this?
Teenagers are hardly, first, they don't want to see themselves as willing dupes of the tech companies. And secondly, they're not. They are engaging in really interesting ways. So kids would show me, for example, how they are proactively navigating the algorithms by intentionally following certain people that would then lead their algorithms in a more positive direction. And this is specifically around body image on Instagram, right? So they're manipulating the algorithm right back. That's not to say that I don't think anything about the algorithm can be harmful, but the kids are engaging in ways to make their own experience better kids in their friend groups are saying, let's all put away our phones, and whoever doesn't put away their phone has to buy the pizza or whatever. And I think the conversations in some ways are healthier and more open than adult friend conversations. I think I might feel that way out to brunch with a friend and wish that she would put away her phone, but I might be reluctant to breach the sort of code, the grown-up code where we don't admonish each other. But peer pressure can be positive, and I think it's really important to say that a lot of kids, the desire to be in can also include using positive peer pressure to get your friends to either put away their phones or to engage in a positive way, to back channel with a friend to take down a harmful post. These are all strategies that kids spoke to me about, reminding people to, get off the game and go touch grass, right? These are things that people are doing. And so I think we need to really look at the ways kids are using tech, the way they experience different affordances of different apps, and certainly to talk to them about the more manipulative things. Like I think Snapchat maps are incredibly manipulative. Being able to see where all your friends are is very painful. It also has a ton of safety risks and privacy risks. Can we talk with kids about the ways these things work and get them thinking about sleep? And I also think, I've been in front of groups of kids and tried to promote sleep by saying things like, if there was something free and legal that made you smarter, more athletic, in a better mood and better looking, would you want more of it? And they're all like, yes. And I'm like, it's sleep, right? So I think we need to think about ways, later school start times, coaches and people who are not parents who have tremendous influence over young people can be promoting sleep. I think it's really important. And, whether it's parents restricting and taking away phones at night, which is a perfectly legitimate thing to do, or using other methods, but getting kids to be on board with the importance of sleep is crucial, because we know the cumulative effects of sleep deprivation are really, really harsh on adolescents and any of us.
And more predictive of mental health problems, more clearly predicted. Yes.
And learning. Common Sense Media did a study of how kids were actually spending their time, speaking of time, and found that in schools where there were bans or where there weren't bans, the kids, it really depended on the teacher. Even if there was a ban, it depended on the kids. I was thinking in advance of this wonderful conversation, if I were Secretary of Education, what would I do? And if I were Secretary of Education, I would have the kids listen to a recent debate that Candace Ogders and Jonathan Haidt did, which I think was a clear laying out of these two different positions. And this podcast, I would have them listen to it, and then I would have them research themselves. What do they find is the impact, and what do they think as the solutions? In the spirit of autonomy support, thank you, Emily. Nothing about us without us. So in terms of kids in this issue, I would have kids coming up with school-wide solutions that work for the teachers, that work for the school, that work for the parents, and work for the kids. And then I would highlight some of the best decisions around the country, some of the best creative solutions. The Aspen Institute has done this with Aspen Challenge for years, which is having kids and teachers together tackling problems. I think that we would make a huge amount of headway if we actually began to involve kids in the solution in the way that you're suggesting, Deborah, but even in a more uniform way, just rather than it happening, but really challenging kids and teachers around the country to make it happen.
I nominate you for Secretary of Education, Ellen.
I second that.
In your future.
And that's such a beautiful point, too, because it just shows how distorting these extreme stances are to actually affording us these opportunities to do these actually productive things. Schools, I speak at schools a lot. I've been going the past few months giving some talks at schools. And they say, so parents are going to bring up the anxious generation. And most educators, Ellen, I think to your point, they know that this is nonsense in many ways. They want to have these sorts of engaging conversations, and parental fear is blocking it. So I just think that's such a great idea, what you brought up.
Well, I think we can't do things the same old way, too. I think in schools, yes, I can understand why it's hard to teach a room full of kids who are watching their own things on TikTok, right? I do understand that. But also, should we be standing in front of the room and lecturing at all in school?
Exactly.
Right. I mean, my own kid goes to a high school where I feel like, 1950 called and wants its curriculum back. I mean, it's 9 42-minute periods with bells. It's a lot of rote learning. I mean, and this is what most high schools look like, right? And this is, a relatively highly ranked high school. So this is what high schools, people think this is what they want high school to look like still to this day. So there's very little student voice and choice. There's very little collaboration or project-based learning. And what we see is people just want to take away the phones to help the kids listen to, boring lectures from the front of the room. Well, you can take away the phones or not. Like, I'm open to schools, experimenting with that. And I think involving students in the conversation is crucial. But we also need to look at what is happening with learning and why, how can we get students involved in doing research? I would love to see kids leading their own studies of phone use and other things in schools with really good design, right? Which could be done in their curricula.
Ellen, did you want to add to that?
So much to say there. Yes. I think if we do begin to involve kids in the solutions in a systematic way around the country, we would have so much better solutions, because it's the autonomy that kids need. But I never totally loved the truth campaign, which set kids up against manipulative adults, so it sort of conveys, oh, adults are horrible, they're out to manipulate you, kind of a thing. Let's use the autonomy in positive ways to help kids come up with solutions.
I agree with that. And at the same time, I've been very resentful of this dialogue, these extreme positions, because I am not a pro-tech person. I'm a pro-kid person. And I actually have huge, massive critiques of the technology industry for the better part of 15 years. And I've written about it and I've thought about it a lot. And yet so I think that these companies have created technology that is for their bottom line and not for humans. And I think there's huge problems. But yet we're in this very odd position, sometimes of feeling like I don't think any of us are defending the bad practices, but we're just put in these extreme positions, which I think is really why we're having this conversation. It's saying we refuse to be boxed into these two ways, the moral panic versus the tech has destroyed kids. There is a third way. And we all have to work towards really articulating what that is, besides just messy and nuanced. Like, we need something that, and I think autonomy support is a wonderful way in. And I think there's some others that I hope we'll talk about in the remaining time we have. Yep.
Just one more thing. I've resented it so much that fear mongering works in a sense. It's, it sells books, it gets attention. Yep. And I think it's the same discussion we're having in politics. Do we play to people's fears, or do we play to people's strength? And so I think if we could, as we're doing in this conversation, shine a light on what kind of world do we want to live in, that we could begin to reduce the impact of fear mongering. It does work because we're programmed to make it work. But we need to be conscious then of saying, no, we're going to resist this. We really want to go that third path that you're talking about, Tracy. As a grandmother, I watch my daughter feel fall prey to this, oh my God, it's so bad, and not think about the good ways that technology is affecting her son, my grandson. And so it just doesn't do us any good, just in our own houses, to have these fear-based messages circulating.
Yeah, it prevents us from seeing those good opportunities. I mean, it literally shuts us down from understanding, oh, wait a second, it's not like a drug. It's like you can't just choose, not, like the way that you can choose not to take heroin, right? Hopefully, it's really not the same situation we're facing when we think about technology in our lives, because technology is not going anywhere. So it just blocks us from understanding how different, this fear-mongering mindset, what an unhelpful, set of choices that puts in front of us compared to the reality of what technology in our lives will mean in the future.
Devora, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I mean, as Tracy said, I've been talking about also some of the risks for a long time too, and I'm certainly not a fan of, at any age, giving kids a very powerful communication device without, mentoring, without working with them to have a plan for how that's going to fit into the rest of their life, thinking about what we're modeling as parents in terms of balance with our own devices, because kids, your 2-year-old will bring you your phone because they know how important it is to you, right? And they will also, restructure all your apps and make you some new videos, right?
Or drop it in the toilet,
Right.
What
One
of mine
incredibly
did.
intuitive, even to pre-readers. And that's a huge boundary, right? Like a tremendous amount of really interesting research about the 0 to 5s, right? And how different like early childhood is because the touchscreens are so much more accessible and manipulatable for someone who can't use a keyboard yet. And when we talk about the political polarization that we're all witnessing and living through, it is really important to understand that one of the risks, especially for isolated kids and especially for some boys, is radicalization, right? And there's sort of there's big radicalization, but there's a lot of kids getting sort of softly used to and accustomed to things like hate speech and slurs online. And so when I talk to kids, a lot of times kids will say, "Oh, I'm smarter than that. I'm hate watching that. And I'm watching it because I disagree with it." And I do lean into conversations about, well, if you're getting used to hearing misogynist, homophobic, or racist slurs or xenophobic slurs, like you're reducing the barriers and the internal visceral disgust in response to that, and because you're getting accustomed to it. And the people who make that content are making money from your eyeballs. And so you're actually supporting it. And you're also teaching the algorithm, like, send this kid more hate speech. So it is really important to talk about some of those risks. And that's where I think media literacy programs in schools are incredibly important to talk about, sources. Where are we learning about current events? Who can we trust? I think it's really important for young people to have the opportunity to be journalists, to research and report for their own school newspaper or TV station, because having to report to an editor is a really important, just like, you're both, Ellen and Tracy and Emily, are all talking about like scientific truth. We also, I think a lot about journalistic truth as well. And like, what is the standard before you can report something? Can I just say, this or that is happening, or do I have to frame that in an opinion piece? Right. And kids, it's very blurry for kids right now because they're getting so much of their news from places like YouTube. So it's really important to do news media literacy and to really make sure they understand some of the limitations of getting your news in places like that.
And I might just chime in here that these are the exact kinds of conversations that highlight that there are so many nuanced concerns here. And that's why we need to unpack this a little bit more than just this is bad, right? It's like, let's talk about some of the risks and some of the things that we can teach kids.
And the differential vulnerabilities that, Tracy has brought up a couple of times, like that's really important to understand. Like many kids could watch some of that and not go down that path, or not, right? Because they have enough protective factors in their life or enough people they could kind of check in with and model from, and sort of like, oh, I experimented with that idea. And that's why I wrote Growing Up in Public, is because I'm worried also about kids getting shamed and going viral for their worst moment, and how we're taking kids out of context, and we're really scrutinizing kids and surveilling kids in ways because of all of this tech that we, couldn't have done in the past. And this is also one of the reasons that parents get so worried, is sometimes they're seeing things that kids share, like a video, very out of context. Whereas in previous generations, we didn't see the conversation on the back of the bus. We didn't read the note that kids passed in class. So it's not that middle schoolers are necessarily any meaner in their social process of norming and storming through middle school, but it's painful as the parent to see the video.
Devorah, could you say a little bit more about the surveillance state piece of it? And actually, we will link to your previous episode on the podcast around this, because you talked a lot about it. But could you just quickly speak to that before we move on?
As parents, we can get behavior updates from Class Dojo for our elementary schoolers and grade updates from our high schoolers. We can monitor our kids' location on Life 360, and we can put an app on their phone that mirrors their texts to us, which is, of all of those, maybe the most invasive, right? So geo-tracking our kids, tracking their grades and school behavior. And some of this data is coming at us whether we want it or not. My kids' school all but forces parents to get these apps. And it's incredibly invasive, and it cranks up parental anxiety a lot. right? Being able to see your kid moving around as a dot on the map, and what happens if their phone dies and you suddenly can't see it. It hooks parents on all this data. We see huge challenges for parents when their kids launch to college because they've been getting, they know if their kid is 2 minutes late to class as a 17-year-old senior, and they know what quiz grade they got. And then the kid gets to college and it's a big black box. And they're like, I don't know what to do. So we need to look at that. And this is, again, an example of just because we can do something technologically, just because we can see where all our friends are on Snapchat doesn't mean it's good for us. Just because I can see if my kid was 3 minutes late to Spanish, that might be a little too much. My kid is in 10th grade. I need to know something about how school is going. I probably don't need that level of micro data.
Right. Ellen, let's hear from you.
Well, this pulls together our conversations about the impact of technology and schools being 1950s and what should happen in schools. And I want to take it back to the brain. During the adolescent years and also the early childhood years, but particularly the adolescent years, is when the brain is making these connections among parts of the brain and where it is a prime time for learning executive function skills. And the digital media that we're talking about needs to, any other thing for kids solving problems, need to build on promoting those skills in children that studies have shown will be a protective factor for them throughout their lives. We need to help kids learn how to have set goals, and we need to help them understand how different people feel different things than they do, and sometimes similar things to them. We need to help them learn the skills of communicating and collaborating. We need to help, and these are all skills based on executive function. We need to help them learn how to take on challenges so that when they go up to that black box of colleges, they can deal with those stressors. We need to help them learn self-control so that they learn ways to manage the things that are tempting in life. So I think that we need to build on the science there and help promote the development of executive function skills, both at home and at school.
And I'd like to turn that over to Emily for this, especially because of your book on autonomy, supportive parenting, and your expertise in that area. I mean, what are your thoughts about skills that kids can learn and how parents can actually use some of these questions and conversations in a way that there's some developmental skill here?
Absolutely. And this was one of my main points that I kept trying to hammer in my debate experience this summer. And I'll just share that one of the rebuttals was parrots and monkeys can scroll on iPads, so we don't need to give the devices to our children younger because they'll learn really fast. And that's not the point. The point is not, can you scroll? Can you push buttons? The point is, can you be thoughtful in a critical way about your behavior? Do you have self-awareness? Do you know the feeling of this is too much time and it's not feeling good anymore? To learn self-regulation. So this is where I think it's a huge missed opportunity if we're thinking we're not going to even allow a child a phone until 17 or something. I fully support parents making the best decisions for their children, knowing their children and their children's risks and vulnerabilities. But I also want to make sure we're focusing on opportunities. And part of the opportunity is the more practice they're getting in really engaging with all kinds of technology is building those skills, including the executive functioning that Ellen was talking about. But it's something I do with my kids all the time, is have conversations about, you are having a really rough week with your friend or boyfriend, or like stress is happening. Do you feel like you're on your phone more? Yeah, I do. Okay. And how is that helping? Well, it's actually not. And so to be able to have these conversations is building that self-awareness that they're going to be so much more well-equipped in their adulthood than most adults right now using devices.
Tracy,
you made the point at the end that I wanted to make, which was that that stance that we have to protect kids instead of prepare them for technology ignores the fact that look at some of the worst compulsive use. It's among people who got these devices as adults. So it's not as if we were able to regulate ourselves. It's that we had this black box era when we were all very technophilia was the flavor of the time. And we just thought, oh, these are these devices that are going to make our lives better. And we didn't think to build those skills, to modulate, to regulate. So if anything, kids have that chance that we never had. And we have the chance to be good mentors to them. And that's the conversation. I think that's, in a sense, what we're saying now is that's the conversation we should be having about kids' tech use and mental health and well-being.
And I think it's also important to build on some of Ellen's work, but just this is also common sense and living life as a parent myself, is when we're expecting the worst from our kids and feeling like they can't be trusted to use technology responsibly, how does that feel to them? And what is going to happen? We know from psychological reactance, the idea, right? I'm going to go against what you want from me. If you want me to have all these limits, I'm going to figure out a way to be excessive with my use. And so I think that we're setting ourselves up and undermining our very hope of raising healthy kids if we're just expecting they're not going to be able to handle it. And so I think seeing that they do have strengths and skills and they can use good judgment and make good decisions. I love, Devora, your story about the paying for the pizza if you're on your phone. They have these capacities. And I think as adults, we need to trust in that more.
It's like giving them a giant like a digital chastity belt. We're thinking that could work.
Well, this is why I don't test digital solutions. I think a lot of parents are like, what's the app I can use to control my kid's digital experience? And I don't trust that for many reasons. And one of the big reasons is that just puts the focus in for your kid on getting around you and going on YouTube and finding a video of a kid telling you how to get around, or finding a burner phone lying around your house and putting it on the Wi-Fi and using that to do the forbidden thing. We need to be mentors. I've been saying for years, mentoring over monitoring, right? We need to be doing the harder work of mentoring, because mentoring involves also looking at our own tech use and thinking about what we're modeling. And have we talked to our kids about in what situation should we go for a face-to-face conversation versus a text or a call, right? What are the emotional implications of choosing different modes of communication? How do we work out a conflict with someone that maybe started online but might not be really able to be resolved there? So these are important skills. And when we don't talk to our kids, we're thumbing out our lives also in front of our kids and not talking with them about the ways we're constantly modulating. Oh, wait, this is a call, or this is for the group text, or this is private, right? We need to help our kids really understand some of those decisions that we're making invisibly.
And one more thing I really want to say is that when our kids feel less judged, they're more likely to share with us. And so we will have more influence if we have a more positive approach in general. So if we want them to come tell us this is what happened, it was a mistake, and we can mentor them better that way.
In my study, the kids talk with us, not at us.
Yep.
And they said, also, again, if we're the problem, we need to be part of the solution. And they said, listen more than you talk.
I think our goal was to really shift a mindset, and that our concern is the effects of the general cultural messaging right now and how that's trickling down to our family lives and our children. And what we're here to do is equip and empower parents with not just data, but also ways of thinking about this that may be refreshing and not getting as much airtime, but can shift things in a more positive direction that feels less scary and fear-based and more strength-based and positive and productive.
And we on Psychologists Off the Clock would like to thank all of you, Tracy, Ellen, and Devora, for being here today. It's so wonderful to hear your expertise. And Emily, of course, you too.
I'm always here.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.